Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah. Margaret, young and Irish, was scarcely beyond teenage when, in order to improve her chances in life, she chose to assume the persona and appearance of a young man and became known as James Barry. Her subsequent career was shockingly egregious. In the use of the adjective unique is entirely appropriate. After living with her story for more or less constantly since 2002, I now look forward over the coming few days to sharing with you some of my discoveries in connection with her long and eventful life. It's echo. Very, very fussy audience. Is that better? Right. Dr. James Barry served in the British Army with some distinction and no little controversy from 1813 to 1859. That is a long time. She was the first woman to have been commissioned as an officer in the British Army, and what is more, she eventually retired. Could I have the next slide, please? This is her visiting card in the rank of Inspector General, which is field rank and the same rank as a brigadier. Yet another first. Some achievement, some woman. The fact that Dr. Barry was a woman only became known to the public about a fortnight after her death in the summer of 1865. Hugely embarrassed, the Army placed a 100-year embargo on all their records concerning Dr. Barry, and that embargo was only lifted in 1965, which is a year many of us still remember. Not only did this significantly hamper efforts to obtain relevant biographical details about Dr. Barry, but frankly shoddy research and pure shameless speculation has interfered with our understanding of the life of this exceptional woman until, and this I say in all modesty, until the publication of my work in August 2 years ago. Could we have the lights, please? Lights down, up, down, up. Sorry, I'm used to lights go slide off. No. Why am I interested in the subject? I first heard about Dr. Barry from my father in about 1944, I guess, when I was about 8 years old. Occasional articles would appear in local magazines such as the Outspan or the Argus or the Cape Times Supplement, and there were also books by Lawrence Green, who frequently mentioned Barry, Madeleine Masson, and so on. There remained also a collective memory of Dr. Barry amongst the poorer section of our community, and that has dissipated, I think, not only because of the passage of time, but also because District 6 was completely flattened, and the people who lived there now are spread out all over the place, or deceased. Now, let us fast forward to the beginning of the new millennium. The Senior Fellow Society of the Royal College of Surgeons of England was established in 1999 with the intention of fostering fellowship, congenial company, and probably the hope for generous bequests from retired fellows. You know the sort of thing. Talks about past experiences by retired surgeons, interesting surgical papers, hobbies, and so on. Interspersed with coffee, lunch, a wine tasting, and general fellowship. Recently retired and back in England, I attended the 2002 meeting of this society and was asked by the secretary to prepare something for the following year. I was rather reluctant because there were such distinguished people there, distinguished men present. Knights, people, titled people, very, very well-known surgeons, with amazing experiences to relate. And what could I, a Capetonian, come up with that they didn't know everything about? So I thought, and after much thought, and a solid year's work, I found myself presenting an illustrated talk about Dr. James Barry on the 17th of November 2003. I'd spent a very full year of research of everything about Dr. Barry that I could get my hands on, and it was disappointing. It was all about the same old stuff, rehashed. Even a very recently published so-called biography about Dr. Barry added almost nothing new. My presentation was held in a ground floor lecture theatre at the college, and the reception was really quite gratifying. Nobody there had actually heard about Dr. Barry before. Are you writing a book? Definitely not, I said. But it was my fate to have been bitten by the Barry bug, and my book eventually was published in London and launched at the Royal College of Surgeons in August 2016. Let's have the next picture, please. This is a mural which appeared in the, sorry, could I have the lights on? A mural which appeared in the lecture theatre in which I gave my presentation. Lights.
You want the lights?
I want the lights down. Yeah. All right, so this mural appeared in the lecture theatre which I used, and there you can see Dr. Barry, the first person to get a diploma from the Royal College of Surgeons in England. And when I was there at the time of the launch of the book, I spoke to the present, or the then president of the Royal College of Surgeons, who was a woman, and she didn't know anything about it. So there we are. Yes, I'd like the light on again. Perplexing questions and shameless guesswork have dogged Barry's story for years, but I'm happy to say that we now have a clear insight and understanding of almost all of the challenging life of Margaret Bulkley, the woman who for no fewer than 56 years passed as a man and who was known as James Barry. At the very outset, it was clear that there were basic unknowns about Dr. Barry, so many questions to be addressed and issues to be resolved. And as a youngster, I remember a rhyme which my mother told me, which went something like this: I keep 6 honest serving men. They taught me all I knew. Their names are what and where and when, and how and where and who. And all of those questions, those simple questions, required answers, because none of the work that had been published up to that time really gave definitive answers. Exactly who was Dr. Barry? Where did she come from? What was her family background? When was she born? What and how did her absolutely unique career come about? And was it true that she'd become a mother? I am now in the position to explain her life to you with a high degree of certainty. I wish particularly also to acknowledge the part played in my work by my collaborator, Jeremy Dronfield, a true professional who not only accessed sources which were not available to me, but who also radically shortened my original book, which was over 300,000 words long, thereby making the manuscript at least readable. It was, of course, fundamental to identify our subject. Who was she? Early attempts relied on pure guesswork or trying to compare samples of handwriting from an early part of her life with a memorandum which was written after her retirement. It wasn't realized by these authors that the memorandum was written by a scrivener and not by Dr. Barry herself. So I was fortunate in finding out who Dr. Barry was from a completely different source. Could we have the next slide, please? This is a part of a letter that Dr. Barry wrote, that Margaret Bulkley wrote to the family solicitor, whose name was Daniel Reardon. And she said that, sorry, let me get my...
You
No, sorry, I just want to put my other specs on. This letter gave us a lot of information. She wished it was written to a man called Daniel Reardon, who was a solicitor, and she wished to introduce she said, I wish to introduce myself from my 3 years probation to his sweet Ellen. Ellen was Reardon's new baby. So her 3 years of probation was the 3 years she was spending at Edinburgh University. She also said, I've been introduced to my Lord Buchan, who was a strong supporter of her father, her uncle. Let's have the next slide, please. There was also another thing here. I thought, and most people said, that Barry and her mother went to Edinburgh by coach. But here in this letter it says it was good for my mother to have a gentleman to take care of her on board ship. And until that time, I didn't know that you could get from London to Edinburgh by sea far more comfortably and far less expensively than by coach, and more quickly. And the letter is signed James Barry. James Barry. Now, Daniel Reardon, the family solicitor, could you have the next slide, please, knew Barry as Miss Bulkley. That's what she was when she last saw him. And could we have I want you to look at that. And could we have the next slide, please? This is a cover of that letter. This is the days before envelopes had been invented. And so the last page of the letter was folded up, the address written on to Daniel Reardon, and it was his habit, as a very careful solicitor, to write the name of the sender and the date of the letter on every bit of correspondence he got. And although the letter was signed James Barry, here we've got Miss Bulkley, 14th of December. Can you have any more clear evidence than that as the real name of the individual? I thought that was a good one. Thank you. This was one of the letters that was in the Lewis Walpole Library in Connecticut, and I've actually put a copy of this letter here for anybody who'd like to see it afterwards. And just to mention the Lewis Walpole Library, could we have the next slide, please? It's a research library situated in a leafy village in Connecticut, and it is only for research fellows. It also has a residential facility for people who want to study there, and also, of course, a croquet pitch. So it caters for the body and the mind of researchers. There's almost one staff member per researcher, and I can strongly recommend this library to anybody who wishes to do research into 18th century English literature or anything like that. Now, in Ireland, the other thing is the age of Dr. Barry. Again, that was an unknown. And there's another letter in the Lewis Walpole in which her mother says, in a letter written in 1804, saying that her age was 15 years old. Now, that made her year of birth 1799, which was the year of the French Revolution. The question of her father has also been raised. And I can say that he was not a Scottish earl. He was not the Prince of Wales. He was a grocer called Jeremiah Bulkley, who lived in Cork, and his clientele were mainly in ship chandling, because he had a shop which is right on the quay in the middle of Cork. Let's have the next table. This is Cork over here. Rufus, my helper, put that ad there. It looks as though it's sort of Not quite up the arsehole of Ireland, but it's sort of halfway up there. That's what they say about. I had played golf with a chap from Hull once, and he said Hull is halfway up the arsehole up the arsehole of England. So it's not an original. So the family lived in Cork. A genealogist described the Barrys as a decayed Cork family of Anglo-Norman descent who had arrived from Wales in the dim and distant past. Here it is a diagram. Next slide, please. Look, okay, let's have the light off. This is this is Merchant's Quay in Cork, and the Barry family would have been in one of those buildings there. Very, very busy harbour. There was great export of food, butter and stuff like that from Cork, despite the people living in Ireland having terrible famine at times. It's paradoxical. Next slide, please. This is a rough genealogical tree of the Barry family. John Barry and Julian. John was a paterfamilias, so we won't go into the rest of them. And he had 5 children. James, who was a Royal Academician and a fine artist. John, who was a builder or an architect who died young. Patrick, who absconded from the Royal Marines and worked at the East India Company. Redmond, who was in and out of the Navy or jail. He was a real rascal. And the only daughter, Mary Ann, born that sort of life. She married Jeremiah Bulkley, who was the grocer, and they had 2 children, John and Margaret Ann. And this is the girl who became James Barry. John was a problem. The catastrophe, there was a catastrophe which resulted in bankruptcy. And this followed the folly of the parents who put too much faith in their son John, who really wasn't much good at all. They paid a huge sum of money for him to be apprenticed to a barrister in Dublin, and they had to pay this money out. He then contracted an ill-considered marriage, and that demanded more money. And finally, he ended up some time later not only did he bankrupt the family, but he ended up as a bankrupt himself in about the worst regiment in the British Army. So that was it wasn't a wise decision. When this started, Mrs. Bulkley, Margaret's mother, wrote a letter to James Barry, her brother. Next slide, please. And he was an artist who trained largely in France and Italy. And although he was a good artist and he was appointed professor of anatomy at the Royal Academy, he was a very scratchy sort of chap. And he didn't go down terribly well with the Academy. And he unwisely took issue with Sir Joshua Reynolds, who was the president of the Academy. But he also, although he was a good artist, the subjects which he liked painting did not have popular appeal to the English art-buying society. He was very much into religious paintings and historical paintings, and there was no market for that because the people in England who could afford to buy paintings wanted pictures from people like Stubbs, who painted horses, or Gainsborough and Reynolds, who painted more kind portraits of people. So James Barry didn't do too well from that sort of thing. Mrs. Bulkley wrote a letter to her brother. Once the family had got into these financial difficulties, she wrote a letter to him, being very careful not to ask him for any money. She hadn't been in contact with him for about 30 years, and she explained the situation. And in this letter, she mentions Margaret and her two daughters. Now, between somehow or other, another daughter had arrived somewhere or other down the line, and that daughter, the conception of that daughter coincided with a visit to the Bulkleys by Redmond Barry. Let's have the next slide, please. Just go off there. She wrote this letter to her brother, and the letter, the mother was in such a state of nervous distraughtness that she couldn't write the letter herself. And so this is a postscript written by Margaret, her daughter, in 1804, so she was 15 years old, and she said, "My mother's not able to write legible on account of a tremor of her hand, desired me to write for her. My inexperience and so much unaccustomed to letter writing, I hope you will be accepted by you by an apology of faults and errors in the letter. By Sir, by your most affectionate niece, etc., 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 Margaret Ann Bulkley." So this is the first sample of handwriting of Margaret Bulkley. Coincidentally, this postscript provides an earlier sample of Margaret's handwriting. Let's have this Barry family tree again, because this, yes, here we are. Can you, there should be, go on to, there's another family tree which comes down. After this, next one. There we are. So here we have the family tree as before, but here there's an addition. There's Redmond, who stayed with this couple in their house in 1802, and he was hounded out of town because they were very cross with something he'd done, and they believed that he had made Margaret, their daughter, pregnant, and she in fact gave birth to a girl called Juliana in 1803. So there are several reasons why I believe this to be true, and because firstly a daughter arrived in this family. They've been married for about 15 years with only 2 pregnancies, and of course a Catholic family, so there were no contraceptives, so they were not very fertile. Then all of a sudden a baby arrives at that time. And what's more, much later one could find signs of pregnancy in Margaret's abdomen when she was being laid out after death. So this is the reason why I think. In April 1804, this letter was written in 1804, and although it was written to James Barry, it produced no reaction in him at all. Then later on that year, Mrs. Bulkley and her daughter were in London to go and see James Barry, the artist, to ask him, as she said, for some advice. And he was hardly civil to Margaret, and so they went home again empty-handed. But things became so desperate, they'd been taken in by friends, that they went again in January the following year. And on this occasion, Margaret was able to see her uncle. Now let's have the next slide, please. This is, incidentally, is the bad uncle, Redmond Barry, and not an attractive chap. He was in and out of the Navy and in and out of jail, alternating. Next slide, please. And this is James Barry, the artist. You saw his picture a short while ago. Are there any medical people in the audience? Right. I'm sorry. Well, if either you're shy or not wanting. This picture, if you look at this man's face, after the earlier one, the facial features are entirely different. And this man has got acromegaly due to a pituitary tumor. I beg your pardon? Acromegaly is a condition in which, in the young, it produces gigantism, very tall boy. It's secreting, the tumor secretes growth hormone. In a mature person, it causes great thickening and coarseness of the facial features and various other symptoms. And this man's death, which occurred in 1806, would have made a spectacular clinico-pathological case, because a friend of his found him in a pub where he'd had a couple of fits. The friend took him home, but the kids in the neighbourhood didn't like Mr. Barry, so they'd stuffed stones into his keyhole. So his friend had to take him to a lodging house for the night. And during that night, he had a massive nosebleed. And that would have been due to the pituitary tumour eroding into the sinuses and inside the nose. And so the blood came out of the nose. And friends of his collected him on the following day, but he developed a chest infection and he died not long afterwards. That was in 1806. But that was a very interesting thing which no previous author had commented upon. Incidentally, although this story is about a woman who became a doctor, I'm the only person medically trained who's ever written about her, and the only one who's ever written a biography of her. Right, now, once James Barry, the artist, had died, it took time for the news to reach Ireland, but Mrs. Bulkley, accompanied by Margaret, hurried back to London. Despite his conspicuous parsimony, Uncle James did leave certain assets, including some ready cash, some investments, paintings, and a library. And the possessions were auctioned. Could I have the next slide, please? Sorry, that was his house in London. And the next slide, please. This is Christie's auction rooms. This is I think it's either a Rowlandson cartoon, and you can see James Christie the Younger at this podium, and people looking at various other artworks there. Christie's was the place to sell stuff, and it's still very, very popular. But also, the Royal Academy had their exhibitions there before they got their present premises. So it was an important place for art activity. The sale did not realise as much money as had been hoped for, and the total was about £3,000. If you multiply that by 100 to get the figure today, is about 30,000, 300,000, and then by 20 you'll get the amount in rands, but I'm not going to do that for you now. What upset Mrs. Bulkley was that Brother Redmond emerged from the woodwork to claim half the inheritance, because James Barry, the artist, had died without leaving a will. And ever short of cash, he bought himself out of the Navy first. He sold some of the paintings to his sister, who'd hoped to make a bigger profit, but then he frittered away the money, and he died a while later pretty well bankrupt. The major disappointment, let's have the next slide. The major disappointment at the sale was this painting, which is a huge thing called The Birth of Pandora. Pandora over here. There, Zeus and Juno. And this painting was 18 feet, this must be about the size of the painting, 10 feet high and 18 feet wide. a bid of £230 was received for it, which was far, far less than had been hoped for. And even then, the person who bid had buyer's remorse and didn't claim the painting. And it languished for years and years and years until finally it was bought for 18 guineas. I mean, the paint alone was worth a fortune. 18 guineas, and it's now in the one of the Manchester art galleries. Now, more valuable than his material assets were the late artist's circle of friends who closed around Mrs. Bulkley and Margaret to do what they could to help. They included a Dr. Fryer, who was the physician to the Duke of Sussex, one of Queen Victoria's relatives. And it was of prime importance that Margaret obtain some sort of employment to get some money, and soon. The options open to her at the time were as a governess, which required a certain amount of training, or a lady's companion, which required a great deal of patience. But there were these deliberations when all of a sudden somebody returned to London. And has anybody here heard of General Francisco Miranda of Venezuela? No. He's the most famous person you've never heard of. Miranda was, he'd had a failed attempt to free his native Venezuela from the yoke of Spain, and he was seeking help, diplomacy and money from the British government. It was just at a time that Napoleon and his lot had moved into Spain, deposed the king, and installed Napoleon's brother Joseph as the king of Spain. And so Britain at this time, having been on the side of Spain, was now against Spain. And Miranda was hoping he would get help and money from the British government. He'd had a remarkable career. I can't go into the whole of this thing, but he was a man who was, in the 1780s, had done an extensive tour of Europe, which lasted for 4 years. And he collected two things. He collected books, to the extent that he had one of the finest libraries in London. And the other thing he collected were women. Usually they were innkeepers' daughters or coachmen's daughters, but he got lucky because Catherine the Great of Russia fell for him in spades, as it were, and he was her bed companion for a long time, much to the annoyance of Prince Potemkin, who was her official lover. I tell you, the people you meet in Barry's story are amazing. Could we have some? So later, Miranda went to France just at the time of the Revolution. The French were having trouble with other armies closing in on them, and Miranda defeated some Prussians in the Low Countries and was rewarded with a barony, and he was raised to the level of a general. That was fine. But another one of the generals was a bit jealous of this, and he reported him to the authorities as being not entirely behind the revolution. So he faced... He was denounced by a rival general and ended up being tried before a revolutionary council, a tribunal. He defended himself. He was a very well-educated man, and amazingly, he was discharged, but not for long. 3 months later, he was again in jail, this time in La Force, which was a jail for better class of people. And it was a notorious prison, but in La Force, this had the next slide, was this woman, who was Delphine, the Marquise de Costine, who was a well-known courtesan and nymphomaniac, and Miranda made himself as comfortable as he could in the prison with the aid of Delphine, of whom it was said she loved everybody, she loved every man, even her husband. Back in England, after he got out this time, he went off to England in disguise, and he planned another attempt to gain Venezuelan independence. With Spain now a puppet of France, the British were far more amenable to help him. And he was also co-opted into seeing Margaret with the others, and he was with this revolution he was planning. There was going to be battle, and he was going to need a medical doctor, and he saw in Margaret an opportunity for training this girl whose intelligence captivated him, and it was he who suggested that she be trained as a doctor. So the arrangements for Edinburgh was chosen as the medical place of choice because Margaret was not known there, whereas she was known in and around London, and it also had a reputation which was second to none in Europe. Just over 2 months before leaving for Edinburgh, Mrs. Bulkley became seriously ill, to the extent that on 25th of August she made her will, and among the matters she requested 5 mourning rings, M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G, rings, to be given to various people whom she spelled out. Remember this, because something crops up about 136 years later, which this has a bearing on. Next, the question. I've told you that Margaret and her mother went to Edinburgh by boat, so that is wrong. Right, you are. Right. So we can, even from documents in the attorney's papers, I was able to establish the date when the couple left by boat for Edinburgh, which was the 30th of November, 1809. That was the day when she was given money by the lawyer for the ticket and to go off to. And that also establishes the time when Margaret assumed the identity of a youth. She couldn't go on the boat as a woman, a young girl, otherwise she couldn't go in the men's compartment. So that 30th end of November 1809 was when this disguise started. That this scheme was supposed to be only temporary for the 3 years, I pointed out a letter that she spoke to Reardon's little girl, that after her 3 years she would make herself known to him again. I beg your pardon. In the same letter, she asked Reardon if there were any letters to her from Ireland or elsewhere, to put the letters in a packet and send them to her mother. So letters wouldn't come to her when she was in Edinburgh. And James Barry proved to be an outstandingly successful and diligent student. There was an important book, a monograph a few years ago called Advancing with the Army, written by Ackroyd and Co. And they studied a cohort of about 350 soldiers, medical men in the British Army in the 18th and 19th century. And they examined a lot of different things, where they came from, what they studied, and that sort of thing. And one of the things they studied was the number of subjects studied and passed by these students, these doctors. Of the 454, 14 only 3 had studied as many as 14 subjects. James Barry studied and passed 15 subjects. So she had a better qualification than any other of the surgeons in the British Army. During this time, James Barry enjoyed the support of Lord Buchan, the Earl of Buchan. Can we have the next slide? Reynolds' portrait of Lord... Sorry, let's move forward. Move forward. Yes, this one. This is the Earl of Buchan, the 11th Earl. It's a very ancient Scottish family. A man who promoted the rights of women and the education of women, and he was also one of the founders of Encyclopaedia Britannica. And he supported Margaret, or the young James Barry, because he supported the artists, bought the paintings, and he realized that there was a relationship between these two. And he again supported Barry right through into the early years of her professional employment. There were famous teachers in Edinburgh at the time, and I'm going to mention just one. That was the idiosyncratic James Hamilton, the professor of obstetrics and gynecology. He was described as an obstetrician and controversialist because he was always getting into trouble or making trouble. And he was a short, stout man, spectacularly argumentative, to whom exception was taken by Dr. Gregory, who was the professor of medicine, professor of physics. It was over a particular publication. So incensed was Gregory at the time that he beat Hamilton with his cane and was obliged to go to court, and he was fined £100 in damages. Following the Crown court proceedings, Gregory said he would willingly pay another similar amount of money for the privilege of beating Hamilton again. So things ran high. The final examination took place in the summer of 1812. Let's have a look at the next slide. This is there was an examination which was all in Latin. The whole question answer was in Latin, and the student also had to produce a dissertation, and this one was on a subject called merocele. Merocele up there, which is an ephemeral hernia, which is a hernia which occurs rather more frequently in women than other hernias. And one wonders whether that wasn't a thing which attracted Dr. Barry to this. But that is the dissertation, and that dissertation passed, and the examination was successful. Right now, there were a whole lot of other things happening in Europe at the time. Napoleon's fateful invasion of Russia, for example. But there were also faraway events which were seriously disrupting Margaret's carefully evolved life plan. In Venezuela, General Miranda's revolution had faltered, and in the end, late in July 1812, at the time of James Barry was doing his finals, he was callously betrayed by the famous Simon Bolivar, who was being mentored by Miranda. And he was taken prisoner by the Spanish, imprisoned in Cadiz, and he died there 3 years later on Bastille Day, probably of typhus. Because after he died, all his clothing was burnt, which was usually done with typhus to get rid of the lice, which was a tragic end for a man of his intellect and ability. So, having gone through this procedure, got a degree, suddenly the anticipated passage to Venezuela disappeared. And it was difficult for the young student now, or newly qualified student, to know what to do. But she could not have gone into practice in England because of the prejudice against women, educated women, which prevailed at that time. So the only apparent alternative was to join the army, still in disguise, and a disguise which had certainly endured for the duration of the student years. And that is what Barry decided to do. Quoting Ackroyd, those are the people who did the study, the Army Medical Services offered a window of opportunity for medical practitioners who lacked the family patronage and contacts to move straight into a lucrative practice in civilian life. Following Edinburgh, the MD then went, next slide please, went to London to St Thomas's Hospital. This is the old St Thomas's over here. And note that church tower, because we will mention it in a minute. And the big attraction at St Thomas's was the next slide please, was Sir Astley Cooper, who was a very famous and adept surgeon at the time. And Barry was able to benefit by watching him in theatre and also lectures which he gave. Let's have the next slide, please. This is a most interesting thing. For whoever goes to London next time, you must go and see this old theatre, St Thomas's Theatre, in that church tower. The whole thing was sealed up in the mid-19th century, and it lay there undiscovered until recent times. And it's a completely preserved operating theatre. There's the table made out of deal. There's a box of sand to catch all the blood, and there's a thing for the surgeon to wash his hands. Not every surgeon washed their hands, and it was said that some surgeons were so particular that they even washed their hands after they'd operated. So, next slide, please. This was one of the most frequent operations done, particularly for army surgeon, amputation of a leg. And you can see the surgeon here dressed for the occasion. He's putting the knife underneath the patient's leg so that he can do it in one cut. And these are the people, this was long before anaesthesia came in, these are people steadying the patient, and you can see a West Indian student amongst those in the theatre. After about 6 months at St Thomas's, next slide please, Dr. Barry went to the Royal College of Surgeons, and this facade still stands there. And she was examined by the Court of Examiners. Next slide, please. Which here you can see them. There's the table. Here is a student petrified. There is Mr. Foster, the president, and each of these people. This is I think it's a Rowlandson or Guildford. These are all caricatures of real people. And up here you see Sarki Bartman. Up there. So, and these are two skeletons of two bad people who had rather tall skeletons. So there is the man in the corner. That's the beadle. And I can tell you a personal experience with the beadle. When I did my fellowship in 1963, and I think mine was about number 450 odd for my examination. You go in by number, not by name. And there's a very fine staircase in the college, and the beadle stands on a half landing about this high with a splendid frogged coat, lots of braid, and he then calls out the numbers of the people who have passed the examination. And it would go, the beadle in my time was a Mr. Pledger, and Mr. Pledger stood there, and I can't give you the exact numbers, but he would say number 23, number 154, number 500 and something, and those are the numbers of the people who had passed, and the numbers which were not spoken, the people knew they hadn't passed. And it was I promise you, it was a very stressful thing to hear those numbers called out, particularly as they were, I think my number was number 400 and something, as they were coming up, and when one heard one's number called, it was like, I don't know. But I think they've stopped that now because today's snowflakes are not tough enough to take that sort of thing. Right, now after that let's just have a look, just next slide. This is important. This is from the examinations register, the Court of Examiners, July 1813, and here you see James Barry, a regimental assistant, paid 2 guineas for the examination. Now this this took me virtually a whole day to find this particular thing. An earlier researcher had used the name Samuel Barry, and they thought it was a mistake by the clerk writing the thing. But it wasn't Samuel Barry. She just hadn't gone far enough in the book to find that. So I feel quite proud of that. When I also showed that to the present, or the then President of the Royal College of Surgeons, a woman, and she didn't know about that either. So I thought that was good. After that weekend, Dr. Barry joined the army, and his first post might be described as an internship at the old York Hospital, Chelsea. That is not the same as the Royal Hospital, Chelsea, which has the Chelsea pensioners with their special gifts. This was a dreadful place, but he required a year there, or better part of a year, before going to a far better hospital in Plymouth. You can show this one. This is the Royal Military Hospital in Plymouth, which is an extraordinary building. It's got these pavilions, which was very advanced to build a hospital in separate pavilions for its day. And not only that, but there's this long 180-yard ambulatory for the men to walk in when the weather was bad. So that was an extraordinary hospital. And I visited that with an old chief of mine, and we both had a very good day and a good lunch as well. The York Hospital was, right you are. Now, when Dr. Barry was at Plymouth, something extraordinary happened. Waterloo had been decided about 6 months earlier, before he went there, on the 14th of June, and you all know that. And by the end of that month, Napoleon attempted to escape. He thought there would be an American ship at La Rochelle, and so he fled to La Rochelle, and lo and behold, there wasn't an American ship, there was the British warship Bellerophon, or as the men called her, Billy Ruffian, because it was difficult to pronounce the classical name. And so Napoleon had no option but be taken prisoner on board Bellerophon, and they sailed across the channel to Torbay. Now, Torbay has special importance to me because I worked at the Torbay Hospital. And when I did a lot of yacht racing in the bay, and I know at this time of the year there are very bad easterly winds which blow into the bay and kick up a sea, and so they moved the boat, the Bellerophon, around to Plymouth, where the harbour was much more sheltered. But their lordships in London didn't quite know what to do with Napoleon, because if you remember, he'd previously been put on Elba and escaped, and they didn't want that to happen again. Napoleon thought he was going to be given a nice, pleasant estate in the home counties, but that wasn't going to happen either. And eventually, as you know, he was transshipped and he was sent to St. Helena. And that has a connection with Barry later. But while he was aboard Bellerophon in Plymouth Sound, he was obviously very famous, and there were a number of people in England who actually thought he was a good guy. So there was this huge crowds of people who came to see the ship, and Napoleon wasted no opportunity of vaingloriously showing himself at the top there. And so he had all this adulation and admiration to him, and he really enjoyed himself, but he wasn't so pleased when he's put onto another. The Bellerophon was very old by now. He was put onto a newer ship and went off to St. Helena, where he eventually died. Now, Dr. Barry arrived in Plymouth in the rank of a hospital assistant, which was the lowest possible rank in the army. But on December the 5th, 1815, he received promotion with a commission. Let's have the next slide, please. This is a very interesting slide. I point you to be... sorry, let me get the specs on. This slide... This was signed, if you see here, first of all, the King George III was having one of his episodes at this time, so it was signed by George PR, Prince Regent, and it to our and trusty and beloved James Barry, Esquire, greetings. We convey these presents constitute an assistant surgeon to the forces. Now, and there's various people signed it, but this has an extraordinary history, which I'll refer to in a later talk. But it's a miracle that this thing on vellum actually survived, because there was a shipwreck in the St. Lawrence River. It was washed ashore, and it had to undergo very careful restoration by a man in Oxford. But this is amazing that this survived. Next one, please. The other thing, this image, which you probably most are familiar with, this was done by a miniaturist in Plymouth. It was customary for young doctors to have their portrait painted in miniature for their girlfriends, or they were too young to have wives. And this is the one which was done of James Barry. I've had it at the British Army Museum in Chelsea, and the period has been recognised as that time that Dr. Barry was in Plymouth. The uniform and the buttons and things are right, but unfortunately at the V&A it was not possible to identify the miniaturist. Probably 3 women who painted miniatures in Plymouth were suggested, but the actual person could not be identified. Lights, please. Now, after his time was up at Plymouth, Dr. Barry was appointed to come to the Cape. And it was a good time to get away from Europe, because the most dramatic event took place far away on the other side of the world. There was a volcano called Mount Tambora, which exploded in 1815. This was the most violent and hugest volcanic explosion ever in recorded history. And recorded history goes back from us to about 3,000 years, when people first started writing. It was a colossal explosion, and it produced climate change to the extent it wasn't sort of a few wimpy degrees this way and that way on some thermometer in East Anglia. This was real climate change, because vast quantities of 24 cubic miles of exploded material was thrust up into the sky, and with the rotation of the Earth it tracked westwards across Asia, Europe and North America, and it produced snow in the summertime. One of the reasons why Napoleon had trouble at Waterloo was it rained so much there that his heavy cannon were bogged down and couldn't be moved around. There was a party being in progress in the Alps. Lord Byron was having a sort of big house party, and the weather was so bad people couldn't go out. And Mary Shelley, that was the daughter of just forgotten the name. That's right. That's right. Mary Wollstonecraft. She started writing a book there, which was Frankenstein. So this, as a result of this volcano, all sorts of stuff happened. And Turner was very much influenced by the colours in the sky at this time, because there was all this particulate matter, and he started painting these extraordinary landscapes and skyscapes, which people thought were possibly, if you'd been around at that time, you can understand that that's what it looked like. But it's been thought that he might have had trouble with his eyes or one thing or another. So that all these things happened as a consequence of the global cooling, the climate change produced by the explosion of this volcano. It was in Indonesia. Right, so fortunately Dr. Barry wasn't affected by this, because he was on his way to Cape Town. He'd left at this time, and the effects of the volcano were not really felt below the equator, and so he had a pleasant journey to sunny South Africa, and on his way here, unaffected by the Tambora cataclysm. So late in the October of 1816, the Indiaman Lord Cathcart sailed from London, bound for Table Bay, and with the young army doctor among her passengers. And for James Barry, a challenging new chapter was beginning, and for us here, this chapter is ending. Thank you. If there are any questions, say again? Yes, light on. Yeah, you can put the lights on. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them if I can. If they're too hard, I'll avoid them.
I missed the bit about how the Barrys knew Miranda.
Well, General Miranda was part of James Barry, the artist circle. That's right. Just one other thing. I've put a few documents here for if anyone wants to see them. This is a reproduction of the page from the Royal College of Surgeons Register. These are the letter which Mrs. Bulkley wrote to her brother in 1804, which was actually written by Margaret. And this is this extraordinary letter from the Lewis Walpole Library in America, which gives us a lot of information, particularly it nails the identity of Dr. Barry as Margaret Bulkley. Thank you. Thank you very much. You've changed.